All right, so let's go to Peterson. It's one of my favorite clips from a class of his. I've played this before on the podcast.
I think that fundamentalists and atheistic scientists have the same problem. The fundamentalists, so we could say the Christian fundamentalists in the US, make the proposition that,
again, Linux is talking about the creation for a Christian cannot be purely explained through physical processes.
Biblical stories, we'll call them mythological stories, are literal representations of the truth. And that might be true depending on what you mean by literal. But what they mean by literal, or what they attempt to make literal mean, is that they're in the same category as scientific facts. Because they don't have the idea that there are different ways of approaching truth, and that truths can serve different purposes. They don't have a sense that your definition of truth is actually something like a tool rather than an ontological statement about the reality of the world. And so the fundamentalists basically make the proposition that the idea that God created the world in 6 days 5,000 years ago is literally true. And they get the 5,000 year estimate, by the way, by going through the genealogies in the Old Testament and adding up the hypothetical ages and figuring out, how long before Moses Adam lived. And some bishop did that back in I think it was in the mid 1800s. I might be wrong about that, but it was somewhere back about that time. And more or less that's been accepted as canonical fact ever since. And then the scientists say, well, yeah, those are empirical truths, they're just wrong. See, and that's the only difference there is between the fundamentalists and the atheist scientists. The fundamentalists say, those are fundamental scientific truths, and they're right, and the scientists say, well, they're scientific truths, they just happen to be wrong.
This is Ken Ham, by the way. This is, well, yeah, it's saying scientific things about the physical world, and that, in this dichotomy Peterson's bringing up for us, is what is happening. The fundamentalist 7-day creationists are saying, no, this is the reality about the coming about of the physical world, what the matter tells us. And the atheistic scientists are saying, no, we're both arguing about the coming about of the physical world, the matter of the earth. It's just that you're wrong about what constitutes the reality of the physical matter. But as Linux is pointing out, that's not a major emphasis in the biblical story. The emphasis is God said, God created, God made. You're already positing something that's outside of the material world that creates the material world. So then you cannot, in a proper Christian worldview, then say that the only thing that matters about the creation story is what the physical world then tells us about its coming about its creation, about its upbringing, about its growth, right? This is the problem that they have. If we're fighting this battle about what constitutes real meaning the physical world, this is physical concordism. This is that the Bible is making propositional truths about the physical world, and as long as we can cohere what the Bible says to the material, to matter, then that's what's true. And Peterson is saying, well, hang on a second, because you're only using true in one sense. You're only saying it's true in the sense of it communicates something to us about physical properties.
Well, I think that's a stupid argument, personally. I mean, for a bunch of reasons. One is that the people who wrote the ancient stories that we have access to were in no way, shape, or form scientists. Modern people tend to think that you think like a scientist, and people have always thought that way. First of all, you do not think like a scientist. Even scientists hardly even think like scientists. But if you're not scientifically trained, you don't think like a scientist at all. So one of the things, for example, that characterizes your thinking is confirmation bias. And so if you have a theory, what you do is wander around in the world looking for reasons why it's true. And a scientist does exactly the opposite of that in the little tiny narrow domain where he or she is actually capable of being a scientist. And what they have is a theory and look for a way to prove it wrong. But believe me, you don't run around doing that. I mean, you can train yourself, so now and then you can do that. You know, you can learn to listen to people, for example, on the off chance that you might be wrong. But that is by no means a natural way of thinking. And of course, the fundamental philosophical axioms of the scientific method weren't developed until Descartes and Bacon and who else? Descartes, Bacon. There's one more. Anyways, the name escapes me at the moment. But you can argue about when science emerged, but it certainly emerged in its articulated form within the last 1,000 years. I think you could say even more specifically that it emerged in the last 500 years. Now you might argue with that and say, well, what about the Greeks and other people who were fairly technologically sophisticated or who invented geometry or that kind of thing? But yeah, bare precursors to the idea of empirical observation. Aristotle, for example, when he was writing down his knowledge of the world, it never occurred to him to actually go out in the world and look at it to see if what he assumed about it was true. And it certainly never occurred to Aristotle to get 20 people to go look at the same thing independently, write down exactly how they went about doing it, compare the records, and then extract out what was common. I mean, that seems self-evident to us to some degree, but you know, it was by no means self-evident to anyone 500 years ago, and people still don't do it. So it's not plausible. If you know anything about the history of ideas, it's not plausible to posit that stories about the nature of reality that existed before 500 years ago were scientific in any but the most cursory of ways. So why we have that argument continually is somewhat beyond me. Part of the reason is, though, that everyone, fundamentalists included, really believe in scientific facts. Even though they hate it, they'll use computers, they'll fly.
Right, okay. So Peterson's point here, and it's one that we should all think about, is the fact that, well, if you're going to take the text of Genesis as telling us about the scientific, physical nature of the world and its coming about, then you're assuming that they were doing science. And as we've said before on this podcast, that's hard to assume because, as he's saying, the views of science and scientism and scientists hasn't been around very long. So to say that these people were treating the story of the God bringing about the world as a scientist would go and investigate the physical world is just not how it would have worked. And if we're going to be people who prize the authorial intent or the original audience and they're hearing it, what they would have associated with what was said about the text, then to claim that it is saying something scientific doesn't correspond because they weren't scientists. So, again, we can have different views on this. I'm not saying you have to take my view and bringing up this example and pushing on this a little bit. What I am saying is that if you do have that view, you have to think about why you have the view. Are you imposing a scientific view of the material world, of the thing that is to be derived from the Genesis story, is something about, mainly, let's say, about the coming of the physical world, or is it about something else? Is it about the fact that God said, that God created, something outside of the material world made the earth? And that should change our whole perspective on the world.